Hello friends, welcome to Storytelling Station and I am Sourav Nath and today I am going to tell you one science fiction story named Hell's Dimension written by Tom Curry.
Professor Lambert, Professor Lambert, open the door. We are the detective from your neighborhood town. We need to ask you about Miss Midge Crawford. Open the door, Professor.
A man who opened the door was about 36, tall, spare, with black hair which was slightly tinged with grey at the temples in spite of his youth, turned large eyes which were filled with agony upon his questioners.
Are you Professor Lambert?
Yes,
We are here to ask you about your assistant, Midge Crawford.
Lambert was already internationally famous for his unique and astounding experiments in the realm of sound and reading. He had been endowed by one of the great electrical companies to do original work, and his laboratory, in which he lived, was situated in a large tract of isolated woodland some 40 miles from New York City. It was necessary for the success for his work that as few disturbing noises as possible be made in the neighborhood. Many of his experiments with sound and ethnic waves required absolute quiet and freedom from interrupting noises. The delicate nature of some of the machines he used would not tolerate so much as the footsteps of a man within 100 yards, and a passing car would have disrupted them entirely. Lambert was terribly nervous. He trembled under the gaze of the stern detective, come with several colleagues from a neighboring town at the call of Meg Crawford's frightened family.
Now, Professor Lambert, tell us what you have done with the body of your assistant. Her car is outside your door, has stood there since early yesterday morning. There are no footprints leading away from the house, and you can't expect us to believe that an airplane picked her off the roof. It will make it a lot easier if you tell us where she is. Her parents are greatly worried about her. When they telephoned, you refused to talk to them, would not allow them to speak to Miss Crawford. They are alarmed as to her fate, while you are not sort of a man who would injure a young woman. Still, things look bad for you. You had better explain fully, Professor.
Yes, I, Detective Phillips pointed dramatically to the picture of a beautiful young woman of 25, light of hair, with large eyes and a lovely face, stood on a working table nearby, and then said,
Can you look at her there and deny you loved her? And if she did not love you in return, then we have a motive for what you have done. Jealousy? Now come tell us what you have done with her. Our men will find her anyway. They are searching the cellar for her now. You can't hope to keep her alive. And if she is dead,
See, see, don't say she's dead.
then you did love her.
Of course I love her, and she returned my love. We were secretly engaged and were to be married when we had finished these extremely important experiments. It is infamous, though, to accuse me of having killed her. If I have done so, then it was no fault of mine.
Then you did kill her?
No, no, I cannot believe she is really gone.
Then why did you evade her parents' inquiries?
Because I have been trying to bring her, to rematerialize her.
You mean to bring her back to life?
Yes.
Couldn't a doctor do that better than you? If she's hidden somewhere about here?
No, no, you do not understand. She cannot be seen. She was dematerialized. Oh, go away. I am the only man, save possibly my friend Dr. Morgan, who can help her now. And Morgan, I have thought of calling him, but I have been working every instant to get the right combination. Go away, for God's sake!
We can't go away until we found out Miss Crawford's fate.
Another detective entered the immense laboratory. He made his way through the myriad strange machines. A weird collection of xylophones, gongs, stone slabs cut in particular patterns to produce odd rhythmic sounds. Electrical apparatus of all sorts. Near Phillips was a plate some feet square of heavy metal, raised from the floor on poles of a different substance. About the ceiling were stars thickly set of the same sort of metal as was the big plate. One of the detectives tapped his forehead, pointing to Lambert as the latter nervously lighted a cigarette. The newcomer reported to Phillips. He held in his hand two or three sheets of paper on which something was written. The detective said to Phillips,
Sir, the only other person here is a deaf mute. I have got his story. He writes that he takes care of things like cooks their meals and so on. And he writes further that he thinks the woman and this guy Lambert were in love with each other. He has no idea where she has gone to. Here, sir, you read it.
Phillips took the sheets and continued.
Yesterday morning, about 10 o'clock, I was pacing the door of the laboratory on my way to make up Professor Lambert's bed.
Suddenly I noticed a queer, shimmering greenish blue light streaming down from the walls and ceiling of the laboratory. I was right outside, and though I could not hear anything, I was knocked down, and I twisted and wriggled around like a snake. It felt like something with a thousand little paws, but with great strength, was pushing me everywhere. When there was a lull and the light had stopped for a few moments, I staggered to my feet and ran madly for my own quarters, scared out of my head. As I went by the kitchen, I saw Miss Crawford at the sink there, filling some vases and arranging flowers as she usually did every morning. If she called to me, I did not hear her or notice her lips moving. I believe she came to the door. I was going to quit when I recovered myself, angry at what had occurred. But then I began to feel ashamed for being such a baby, for Professor Lambert has been very good to me. About 15 minutes after I went to my room, I was able to return to the kitchen. Miss Crawford was not there, though the flowers and faces were. Then, as I started to work, still a little alarmed, Professor Lambert came rushing into the kitchen, an expression of terror on his face. His mouth was open, and I think he was calling. He then ran out, back to the laboratory. and I have not seen Miss Madge since. Professor Lambert has been almost continuously in the workroom since then, and I kept away from it because I was afraid. Two more members of Philip's squad broke into the laboratory and came toward the chief. They had been working at physical labor, but they were still perspiring, and one regarded his hands with a rueful expression.
Any luck?
No, boss. We have been all over the place, and we dug every spot we could. Get to earth in the cellar. Most of it's 3-inch concrete, without a sign of a break.
Did you look in the furnace?
We looked there at the first thing. She ain't there.
There were several closets in the laboratory, and Phillips opened all of them and inspected them. As he moved near the big plate, Lambert uttered a cry of warning. "Don't disturb that! Don't touch anything near it!"
All right, all right.
The skeptical detectives had classified Lambert as a nut and were practically sure he had done away with Madge Crawford because she would not marry him. Still, they needed better evidence than their mere beliefs. There was no corpse delicit, for instance. Controlling his emotions with a great effort, Lambert said at last, "Gentlemen, look, I will admit to you that I am in trepidation and state of mental torture as to Miss Crawford's fate. You are delaying matters, keeping me from my work,"
He thinks about work when the girl he claims he loves has disappeared.
said Dorothy in a loud whisper to Phillips. Dorothy was one of the detectives who had been digging in the cellar, and the hard work had made his temper short.
You must help us find Miss Crawford before we can let you alone. Can't you understand that you are under grave suspicion of having injured her or hidden her away? This is a serious matter, Professor Lambert. Your experiments can wait.
Shaking his fists, Lambert shouted, "This one cannot! You are fools!"
Steady now, Professor.
Perhaps you had better come with us to the district attorney's office. There you may come to your senses and realize the futility of trying to cover up your crime. If you have committed one. If you have not, why do you not tell us where Miss Crawford is?
"Because I do not know myself. But you cannot take me away from here. I beg of you, gentlemen, allow me a little more time. I must have it." Phillips shook his head and said,
Not unless you tell us logically what has occurred.
"Then I must, though I do not think you will comprehend or even believe me. Briefly, it is this. Yesterday morning, I was working on the final series of experiments with a new type of harmonic overtones plus a new type of sinusoidal current which I had arranged with a series of selenium cells. When I finally threw the switch, I remember I was many weeks preparing the apparatus and had just put the final touches on early that morning. There was a sound such as never had been heard before by human ears, an indescribable sound, terrifying and mysterious. Also, there was a fierce, devouring radiator blue light, and this came from the plates and studs you see. But so great was its strength that it got out of control and leaped about the room like a live thing.
For some moments, while it increased in intensity as I raised the power of the current by means of the switch I held in my hand, I watched and listened in fascination. My instruments had ceased to record, though they are the most delicate ever invented and can handle almost anything which man can even surmise.
The perspiration was pouring from Lambert's face as he recounted his story. The detectives listened, comprehending but a little of the meaning of the scientist's words.
What has this to do with Miss Crawford?
Phillips held up his hand to silence the other sleuth.
Ah, let him finish. Go on, Professor.
The sensations which I was undergoing became unendurable. I was forced to cry out in pain and confusion. Miss Crawford evidently heard my call. For a few moments later, just as the terrific unknown force reached its apex, she dashed into the laboratory and stepped across the plate you see there. I was powerless, though I shut off the current by a superhuman effort. But see, she was gone.
Gone? What do you mean, gone?
She disappeared before my very eyes, torn into nothingness by the fierce force of the current or sound. Since then, I have been trying to reproduce the conditions of the experiment, for I wish to bring her back. If I cannot do so, then I want to join her, wherever she has gone. I love her. I know now that I cannot possibly live without her. Will you please leave me alone now so that I can continue?
Dorothy laughed derisively.
What a story.
Keep quiet, Dorothy. Now, Professor Lambert, your explanation of Miss Crawford's disappearance does not sound logical to us. But still, we are willing to give you every chance to bring her back. If what you say is true, we cannot leave you entirely alone because you might try to escape or you might carry out your threat of suicide. Therefore, I am going to sit over there in the corner, quietly, where I can watch you but will not interfere with your work. We will give you until midnight to prove your story. Then you must go with us to the district attorney. Do you agree to that?
I agree. Let me work in peace. And if I do not succeed, then you may take me anywhere you wish, if you can.
Dorothy and the others, at Philip's orders, left from the laboratory. When they were alone and the professor was preparing to work, Philip said,
One thing more, Professor. How do we explain the fact, if your story is true, that Miss Crawford was killed and made to disappear, while you yourself, close by, were uninjured?
Do you see these garments?
asked Lambert, indicating some black clothes which lay on the bench nearby.
They insulated me from the current and partially protected me from the sound, though the force was very great, great enough to penetrate my insulation. It was handicapped in my case because of the garments.
I see. Well, you may go on now.
Felix moved in the chair he had taken from time to time. He could hear the noises of his men, still searching the premises for Madge Crawford, and Professor Lambert heard them too. At last, he cried,
Will you please tell your men to be quiet?
There were dark circles under Lambert's eyes. He was working in a state of feverish anxiety. When the girl he loved had dematerialized from under his very eyes, panic had seized him. He had ripped away wires to break the current and lost the thread of his experiment, so that he could not reproduce it exactly without much labor. The scientist put on the black robes, and Phillips wished he too had some protective armor, even though he did believe that Lambert had told them a parcel of lies. The deep mute story was not too reassuring. Phillips warned his companions to be more quiet, and he himself sat quite still. Lambert knew that the detectives thought he was stark mad. He was aware of the fact that he had but a few hours in which to save the girl who had come at his cry to help him, who had loved him and whom he loved, only to be torn into some place unknown by the forces which were released in his experiment. And he knew he would rather die with her than live without her. Lambert labored feverishly, though he tried to keep his brain calm in order to win. His notes helped him up to a certain point, but when he had made the final touches, he had not had time to bring the data up to the moment, being eager to test out his apparatus. It was while testing that the awful event had occurred, and he had seen Madge Crawford disappeared before his very eyes. Her eyes, large and frightened, burned in his mind. A deaf mute Felix, a small, spare man of about 50, sent the professor some food and coffee through one of the slits. Lambert swallowed the coffee, but waved away the rest impatiently. Phillips, watching his suspect constantly, was served a light supper at the end of the afternoon. There seemed to be a million wires to be touched, tested, and various strange apparatus. Several times later on in the evening, Lambert threw the big switch with an air of expectancy, but little happened. Then Lambert would go to work again, testing, adjusting this and that, till Philip swore under his breath.
Only an hour more, Professor,
said Phillips, who was bored to death and cramped from trying to obey the professor's order to keep still. A circle of cigarette ends surrounded the detective.
Only 1 hour? Will you please be quiet, my man? This is a matter of my fiance's life and death.
Phillips was somewhat disgruntled, for he felt he had done Lambert quite a favor in allowing him to remain in the laboratory for so long to prove his story. After a few minutes later, Lambert said,
Ah, I wish Dr. Morgan were here. I suppose I ought to have sent for him. Detective, will you allow me to get him? I cannot seem to perfect this last stage.
no time now. I said till midnight.
It was obvious to Lambert that the detective had become certain during the course of the evening that the scientist was mad. The ceaseless fiddling and the lack of results or even speculators' sites had convinced Philip that he had to do with a crank.
I think I have it now.
What?
The original combination? I had forgotten one detail in the excitement, and this threw me off. Now I believe I will succeed in one way or another. I warn you, be careful. I am about to release forces which may get out of my control.
Well, now, don't get reckless.
Begged Phillips nervously. The array of machines had impressed him, even if Lambert did seem a fool. You insist upon remaining, so it is your own risk. Lambert, in the strange robes, was a bizarre figure. The hood was thrown back, exposing his pale, black bearded face, the wan eyes with dark circles under them, and the twitching lips.
And if you find yourself living this vale of tears, you will at least have the comfort of realizing that as the sound force disintegrates your mortal form, you are among the first of men to be attuned to be the vibration of unknown sound world. All matter is vibration. That has been proven. A building of bricks, if shaken in the right manner, falls into its component parts. A bridge crossed by soldiers in certain rhythmic time is torn from its mooring. A tuning fork receiving the sound vibration from one of a similar size and shape being vibrate in turn. These are homely analogies, but appeal to the less familiar sound vibration which make up our atomic world. They may help you to understand how the terrific forces I have discovered can disintegrate flesh.
The scientist looked inquiringly at Phillips, as the detective did not move, but sat with folded arms.
I am ready.
Lambert raised his hood, and Phillips, in a spirit of bravado, said that
You can't scare me out of here.
here goes the switch. Lambert made the contact, as he had before. He stood for a moment, and this time the current gained force. Lambert pushed his lever all the way over. A terrible greenish blue light suddenly illuminated the laboratory, and though the air there came sound vibrations which seemed to tear at Philip's body. He found himself on the floor, knocked from his chair, and he writhed this way and that, speechless, suffering a torment of agony. His whole flesh seemed to tremble in unison with the waves which emanated from the machines which Lambert manipulated. After what seemed hours to the suffering, the force diminished, and soon Phillips was able to rise. Trembling, the detective cursed and yelled for help in a high-pitched voice.
Help! Help!
Lambert, on the other hand, had thrown back his hood and was rocking to and fro in agony.
Mage! Mage! What have I done? Come back to me! Come back, please! And we will be again, Mage?
Arrest him. I have stood enough of his nonsense.
The detectives started for Lambert. He saw them coming and swiftly threw off the protective garments he wore. Stand back!
Lambert cried, and threw the switch all the way over. The radiator green lights smashed through the air, and the queer sound sensations smacked and tore them. Dorothy, who had drawn a revolver when he was answering Philip's cries, fired the gun into the air, and the report seemed to battle with the vibrating ether. Lambert, as he threw the switch, leaped forward and landed on the metal plate under the ceiling studs. In the very center of the awful disturbance and unprotected from its force. For a few moments, Lambert felt racking pain, as though something were tearing at his flesh, separating the very atoms. The scientists saw the wriggling figures of the detectives in various strange positions, but his impressions were confused. His head wheeled round and round. He swayed to and fro, and finally he thought he fell down, or rather that he had melted as a lump of sugar dissolves in water.
Oh, he's gone! Gone!
In the heart of nothingness was Lambert, his body torn and racked in a shrieking chaos of sound and a blinding glare of iridescent light which seemed too much to bear. His last conscious thought was a prayer that, having failed to bring back his sweetheart, Madge Crawford, he was undergoing a step towards the same destination to which he had sent her. John Lambert came to with a shudder, but it was not a mortal shudder. He could sense no body, had no sense of being confined by matter. He was in a strange, chilly place, a twilight region, limitless without dimensions. Yet he could feel something, in an impressional way, vaguely indifferent. He had no pain now. He was moving somehow. He had one impelling desire, and that was to discover Madge Crawford. Perhaps it was this thought which directed his movements. Intent upon finding the girl, if she was indeed in the same strange world that he was, he did not notice for some time. How long? He had no way of telling. That there were other beings which tried to impede his progress, but he grew more accustomed to the unfamiliar sensations he was undergoing. He found his path blocked again and again by queer beings. They were living, without doubt, and had intelligence and evidence hostility toward him. But they were shapeless as amoebas. He heard them in a sort of soundless whispers, and could see them without the use of eyes. And he shuddered, though he could feel nobody in which he might be confined. Still, when he pinched viciously with invisible fingers at the spot where his face should have been, a twinge of pain registered on the vague consciousness which appeared to be all there was to him. He was not sure of his substance, though he could evidently experience human sensations which his amorphous body. He did not know whether he could see, yet he was dodging this way and that, as the beings who could occupy this world tried to stop him. They gave him the impression of grey shapes, and in coppery shadows things gleamed and closed in on him. He seemed to hear a cry, and he knew that he was receiving a call for help from Mage Crawford. He tried to run, pushed determinedly toward the spot, impelled by his love for the girl. Now, as he hurried, he occasionally was stopped short by collision with the formless shapes which were all about him. He was hampered by them, for they followed him, making a sound like wind heard in a dream. Whatever medium he was in was evidently thickly inhabited by the hostile beings who claimed this world as their own. Though he could not actually feel the medium, he could sense that it was heavy. He leaped and ran, fighting his way through the increasing host, and the roar of their voice impression increased in his consciousness. Yet there seemed to be nothing tangible save vagueness. He felt he was in a blind spot in space, a place of no dimensions, no time, where beings abhorred by nature, things which had never developed any dimensional laws existed. The cry for help struck him with more force this time. Lambert, whatever form he was in, realized that he was close to the end of his journey to Mage Crawford. He tried to speak, and had the impression that he said something reassuring. He then bumped into some vibrational being which he knew was Mage. His ears could not hear, nor could his flesh feel, but his whole form or cerebrum sensed the hell of the woman he loved in his arms, and she was speaking to him in accents of fear, begging him to save her.
John, John, you have come at last. They have been torturing me terribly. Save me.
Darling Mage, I will do everything I can. Now I have found you, and we are together, and will never part. Can you hear me?
I know what you are thinking and what you wish to say. I can't exactly hear. It all seems vague and impossible. Yet I can suffer. They have been hitting me with something which makes me shudder and shake. There, they are at it again.
Lambert felt the sensations, now which the girl had made known to him. He felt crowded by grey beings, and his existence was troubled by spasms of pain impressions. He knew Mage was crying out too. He could not comprehend the attacks or guess their meaning, but the situation was unendurable. Anger shook him, and he began to fight, furiously but vaguely. They were closely hemmed in, but when Lambert began to strike out with hands and legs, the beings gave away a little. The scientist tried to shout, and though he could actually hear nothing, the result was gratifying. The formless creatures seemed to scatter and draw back in confusion as he yelled his defiance.
They hate that. I have screamed myself hoarse, and that is why they have not killed me, if I can be killed.
I do not believe we can, but they can torture us. It is an everlasting half-life or quarter-life, and these creatures who call this hell's dimension home have nothing but hatred for us in their consciousness.
The inhabitants of the imperfect world had
closed in once again, and the sharp instruments of torture they used were being thrust into the invisible bodies of the two humans. Each time, Lambert was unable to restrain his cries, for it seemed that he was being torn to pieces by vibrations. He yelled until he could not speak above a whisper, or at least until the impression of speech he gave forth did not trouble the beings. The two humans, still bound to some extent by their mortal beliefs, were civied to and fro, and struck and bullied. The creatures seemed to delight in this sport. The two felt they could not die, yet they could suffer terribly. Would this go on through eternity? Was there no release? They were trying to tear Madge away from him. She was fighting them, and Lambert, in a frenzy of rage, made a determined effort to get away with the girl from their tormentors. They retreated before his onslaughts, drawing Madge after him. Lambert put down his head, or believed he was doing so, and ran as fast as he could at the beings. He bumped into some invisible forms and was slowed in his rush, but he shouted and flailed about with his arms and tried to kick. Madge helped by screaming and striking out. They made some distance in his way, or so they thought, and the horrid creatures gave way before them. All about them was the coppery sensation of the medium in which they moved. Lambert, as he became more used to the form he was inhabiting, he began to think he could discern dreadful eyes which stared unblinkingly at the couple. He fought. He fought on, and believed they had come to a spot where the beings did not molest them, though they still sensed the things glaring at them. Were they on some invisible eminence above the reach of the square creatures? We might as well stop here, for if we try to go further, we may come to a worse place. They rested there, in temporary peace, together at last. Clinging close, Madge said,
I seem to be happy now. I feared I would never see you again. John dear, I ran to you when you called out that day, and when I crossed the plate, I was torn and racked and knocked down. When I next experienced sensation, it was in this terrible form. I am becoming more used to it, but I kept crying out for you. The beings, as soon as they discovered my presence, began to torment me. More and more have been collecting, and I have a sensation of seeing them as horrible, revolting beasts. Oh, John, I don't think I could have stood it much longer if you hadn't come to me. They were driving me on, ceaselessly torturing me.
Curse them! I wish I could really get hold of some of them. Perhaps, Madge, I will be able to think of some escape for us from this hell's dimension.
Yes, darling. I could not bear to think that we are eternally damned to exist among these beings, hurt by them and unable to get away. How I wish we were back in the laboratory, at the tea table. How happy we were there.
And we will be again, Madge? Lambert was far from feeling hopeful, but he tried to encourage the girl into thinking they might get away. However, he was unable to dissimulate. She felt his anguish for her safety.
But I know now that you love me. I can feel it stronger than ever before, John. It seems like a great rock to which I can always cling your love. It projects me from the hatred that these beasts pour out against us.
Since they had no sense of time, they could not tell how long they were allowed to remain unmolested. But in each other's company, they were happy, though each one was afraid for the safety of the loved one. They spoke of the mortal life they had lived and their love. They felt no need of food or water, but clung together in a dimensionless universe held up by love. The lull came to an end at last. There was no change in the coppery voices about them which they sensed as the surrounding ether, but all was changeless, boundless. Lambert, close to Madge Crawford, felt that they were about to be attacked. He had swift, temporary impressions of seeing saucer-like, unblinking eyes, and then hordes of bizarre inhabitants started to climb up to their perch. For a short while, Lambert and Madge fought them off, thrusting at them, seeming to push them backward down the intangible slope. The cries which the dematerialized humans uttered also helped to hold the leaders of the attacking army partially in check, but the vast number of beings swept forward. The thrust of the torture fields they emanated became more and more rapid as the two unfortunates shuddered in horror and pain. The power of demonstrate loud noise was evidently impossible to the creatures, for their only sounds came to Madge Crawford and John Lambert as long drawn out, almost unbearable squeaks, mouse-like in character. Perhaps they had never had the faculty of speech, since they did not need it to communicate with one another. Perhaps they realized that the racket they could make would hurt them as much as it did their enemies. Lambert, Madge, clinging to him, was forced backward down the slope, and the beings had the advantage of height. He could not again reach the eminence, but the way behind seemed to clear quickly enough, though thrusts were made at him innumerable times with the torture fields. The horse pushed them backward and ever back. They were forced on for some distance. As they retreated, the way became easier, and fewer of the beings impeded the channel along which they moved, though in front of them and on all sides above beneath, they were pressed by the hordes.
They are forcing us to some place they want us to go.
We can do nothing more.
Lambert felt her quiet confidence in him, and that as long as they were together, all was well.
Maybe they can kill us somehow.
And now Lambert felt the way was clear to the rear. There was a sudden rush of the creatures, and needle-like fields were impelled viciously into the spaces the two humans occupied. Madge cried out in pain, and Lambert shouted. The thong drew away from them as suddenly as it had surged forward, and an instant later the pair, clinging together, felt that they were falling.
Are you alright, Madge?
Yes, John.
But he knew she was suffering. How long they fell, he did not know, but they stopped at last. No sooner had they come to rest
Then they were assailed with sensations of pain, which made both cry out in anguish. There, in the spot where they had been thrust by the hordes, they felt that there were some terrific vibration, which racked and tore at their invisible forms continuously, sending them into spasms of sharp misery. They both were forced to give vent to their feelings by loud cries, but they could not command their movements any longer. When they tried to get away, their limbs moved, but they felt that they remained in the same spot. The pain shook very fraction of their souls.
We are in some pit of hell, into which they have thrown us, John.
Lambert knew she was shivering with the torture of that great vibration from which there was no escape, that they were in a prison pit of hell's dimension.
Oh, John, I'm dying.
But he was powerless to help her. He suffered as much as she. Yet there was no weakening of his sensations. He was in as much torture as he had been at the start. He knew that they could not die and could never escape from this misery of hell. Their cries seemed to disturb the vacuum about. Lambert, shivering and shaking with pain, was aware that great eyes, similar to those which they had thought they saw above, were now upon them. Quicks were impressed upon him, quicks which expressed disapprobation. There were some of beings in the pit with them. Madge knew they were there too. She cried out in terror.
Will they add to our misery?
But the creatures in the vacuum were pinned to the spot they occupied, as were Madge and Lambert. From their squeaks, it was evident they suffered too, and were fellow prisoners of the mortal.
Probably the cries we make disturb them, vibrations to which we, and they are not attuned, are tortured to the form we are in. Evidently, the inhabitants of this hell would punish offenders by condemning them to this eternal torture.
Why did they treat us so?
Perhaps we jarred upon them, hurt them, because we are not of their kind exactly. Perhaps it was just their natural hatred for us as strangers.
They did not grow used to the terrible eternity of torments. No, if anything, it grew worse as it went on. Still, they could visualize no end to the existence to which they were bound. Throbs of awful intensity rent them, tore them apart myriad times. Yet they still felt as nearly as before and suffered just as much. There was no death for them, no release from the intangible world in which they were. Their fellow prisoners squeaked at them, as though imploring them not to add to the agony by uttering discordant cries. But it was impossible for Madge to keep quiet, and Lambert shouted in anguish from time to time. There seemed to be no end to it, and yet, after what was eternity to the sufferness, Madge spoke hopefully.
Darling John, I fear I am really going to die. I am growing weaker. I can feel the pain very little now. It is all vague, and is getting less real to me. Goodbye, sweetheart. I love you, and I always will.
No, no, don't leave me, Mage!
He clung to her, yet she was becoming extremely intangible to him. She was melting away from his embrace, and Lambert felt that he too was weaker, even less real than he had been. He hoped that if it was the end, they would go together. Desperately, he tried to hold her with him, but he had little ability to do so. The torture was still wrecking his consciousness, but was becoming more dreamlike. There was a terrific snap, suddenly, and Lambert lost all consciousness.
Water, water! Bring some water quickly!
Lambert, opening his eyes, felt his body writhing about, and experienced pain that was mortal. A bluish-green light dazzled his pupils and made him blink. Something cut into his flesh, and Lambert rolled about, trying to escape. He bumped into something soft. He clung to this form and knew that he was holding onto a human being. Then the light died out, and in its stead was the yellow, normal glow of the electric lights. Weak, famished, almost dead of thirst, Lambert looked about him at the familiar sights of his laboratory. He was lying on the floor, close by the metal plate, and at his side, unconscious but still alive to judge by his rising and falling breast, was Madge Crawford. Someone bent over him and pressed a glass of water against his lip. He drank, watching while a mortal whom Lambert at last realized was Detective Phillips bathed Madge Crawford's temples with water from a pitcher and forced a little between her pale drawn lips. Lambert tried to rise, but he was weak and required assistance. He was dazed, still, and they sat him down in a chair and allowed him to come to. He shuddered from time to time, for he still thought he could feel the torture which he had been undergoing. But he was worried about Madge and watched anxiously as Phillips, assisted by another man, walked over the girl. At last, Madge stirred and moaned faintly. They lifted her to a bench, where they gently restored her to full consciousness. When she could sit up, she at once cried out for Lambert. The scientist had recovered enough to rise to his feet and staggered toward her.
Here I am, darling.
John, we're alive. We're back in the laboratory.
Ah, Lambert. Glad to see you.
Althus Morgan, the renowned physicist, came forward calmly, with outstretched hand.
So you realized your great ambition, eh? But where would you be if I had not been able to bring you back?
In hell, or hell's dimension anyway.
He went to Madge, took her in his arms.
Oh, darling, we are safe. Morgan has managed to rematerialize us. We will never again be cast into the void in this way. I shall destroy the apparatus and my notes. Dorothy, who had been out of the room on some errand, came into the laboratory. He shouted when he saw Lambert standing before him.
So you got him? Where was he hiding?
His eyes fell upon Madge Crawford then, and he exclaimed in satisfaction.
You found her?
No, they came back. They suddenly appeared out of nothing, Dorothy.
Don't kid me, they were hiding in a closet somewhere. Maybe they can fool you guys, but not me.
Lambert spoke to Phillips then.
I am starving to death, and I think Miss Crawford must be too. Will you tell Felix to bring us some food? Plenty of it.
One of the detectives went to the kitchen to give the order. Lambert turned to Morgan.
How did you manage to bring us back?
It was all guesswork at the last. I at first could check the apparatus by your notes, and this took some time. You know you have written me in detail about what you were working on. So when I was summoned by Detective Phillips, who said you had mentioned my name to him as the only one who could help, I could make a good conjecture as to what had occurred. I heard the stories of all concerned, and realized that you must have dematerialized Miss Crawford by mistake, and then, unable to bring her back, had followed her yourself. I put on your insulation outfit and went to work. I have not left here for a moment, but have snatched an hour or two of sleep from time to time. Detective Phillips has been very good and helpful. Finally, I had everything in shape, but I reversed the apparatus in vital spots and tried each combination until suddenly, a few minutes ago, you were rematerialized. It was a desperate chance, but I was forced to take it in an endeavor to save you.
Lambert held out his hand to his friend and said gratefully,
Oh, Morgan, I can never thank you enough. You saved us from a horrible fate. But you speak as though we had been gone in a long while. Was it many hours?
Hours. Man, it was 8 days. You have been gone since a week ago last night.
Lambert turned to Phillips and begged to him.
I must ask you not to release this story to the newspapers, please.
Phillips smiled and turned up his hands in a gesture of frank wonder and said,
Professor Lambert, I can't believe what I have seen myself. If I told such a yarn to the reporters, they'd never forget it. They'd get me out of the department.
Oh, they were hiding in a closet. Come on, we've wasted too much time on this job already. Just a couple of nuts, says I.
The detectives, after Phillips had shaken hands with Lambert, left the laboratory. Morgan, a large man of middle age, joined them in a meal, which Felix served to the three on a folding table brought in for the purpose. Felix was terribly glad to see Madge and Lambert again, and manifested his joy by many bobs and leaps as he waited upon them. A grin spread across his face from year to year. Morgan asked innumerable questions. They described as best they could what they could recall of the strange dominion in which they had been, and the physicist listened intently. At last he said,
It is some hell's dimension, as you call it.
Where it is, or exactly what, I cannot say. But I surely have no desire to return to that world of hate.
Madge, happy now, smiled at him, and he leaned over and kissed her tenderly.
Darling, we have come from hell together, and now we are in heaven. Mwah!